Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I want to share something a little different, something that's been on my mind for a while now. There's a letter in my kitchen drawer that I've read so many times the folds have started to tear. It's from my father, and it's the only time he ever told me he loved me. He was already dead by the time I found it. My name is Arthur Whitfield. I'm 83 years old, and I spent the better part of 60 years believing my father didn't care about me. I was wrong about that, but understanding why I was wrong and what his silence actually meant, it took me almost my entire life to figure out. My father was born in 1918 in a small town in eastern Ohio called Bel Air, right along the river. His own father, my grandfather, worked in the steel mills. He died of a heart attack on the factory floor when my father was 11 years old. I didn't learn that detail until I was well into my 40s, because my father never talked about it. He never talked about much of anything, really, not the things that mattered. He'd talk about the weather, and he'd talk about the truck, and he'd talk about what needed fixing around the house. But if you asked him how he felt about something, anything at all, he'd look at you like you'd asked him to explain the color blue to a blind man. He simply didn't have the language for it. And for most of my life, I thought that meant he didn't have the feeling either. My mother was different. My mother would hold your face in her hands and tell you she loved you, like she was afraid you might forget. She was warm in the way that people describe when they talk about what a home is supposed to feel like. And because she was so open with her affection, my father's silence felt louder. It felt deliberate. When you grow up with one parent who says everything and another who says nothing, you start to believe the quiet one is making a choice. You start to believe the silence is the message. I was the youngest of 3 boys. My brothers, Dale and Robert, were both older by enough years that they felt more like uncles than siblings when I was small. They left home early, Dale to the army and Robert to a job in Akron, and by the time I was 12, it was mostly just me and my parents in that house. My mother worked mornings at the school cafeteria, and my father worked at a machine shop about 20 minutes outside of town. He left before I woke up most days and came home with his hands black from grease and his shoulders carrying something I couldn't name. He'd eat dinner without saying more than a few words, sit in his chair in the living room, and fall asleep with the television on. That was the routine. That was every night of my childhood. I don't want to make him sound cruel, because he wasn't. He never raised a hand to any of us. He never yelled, not once that I can recall. He was just absent in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who didn't live with it, because he was physically there every single day. He sat at the same table. He slept in the same bed. He drove me to school when the weather was bad. But there was a wall between him and the rest of us that none of us knew how to get past. And after a while, I stopped trying. The moment I remember most clearly, the one that I carried with me for decades like a stone in my chest, happened when I was 14. I'd made the varsity baseball team as a freshman, which was a big deal at our school. I was a pitcher, and I was good, genuinely good, the kind of good where the coach pulled my mother aside and told her I might have a future in it. I came home the day I made the team, and I was buzzing with it, the way boys are at that age when something finally goes right, and the world feels like it's opening up. I told my father at dinner. I said, "Dad, I made varsity." He looked up from his plate, and he nodded, and he said, "That's good." And then he went back to eating. That was it. That was the whole conversation. My mother hugged me and made a cake the next day, but from my father, I got 2 words and a nod. I lay in bed that night, and I made a decision that I didn't fully understand at the time, but that shaped the next 40 years of my life. I decided that I would stop wanting anything from him. I decided that whatever he was capable of giving, it wasn't enough, and that the wanting was what hurt, not the absence. So I sealed it off. I became polite with him, respectful, but I stopped reaching. I stopped telling him things that mattered to me, because every time I did, His response made me feel like I'd offered someone a gift and watched them set it down on the counter without opening it. I went to college on a partial scholarship, the first in my family to go. My father drove me there in his truck, and we barely spoke for the entire 3-hour drive. When he dropped me off, he shook my hand. He shook my hand like I was a business associate. I watched him drive away, and I thought, well, that's that. That's all there is. And I carried that handshake with me for years, like proof of something I'd always suspected, that I was not the kind of son who inspired love in his father, or maybe that he was not the kind of man who had love to give. I met my wife, Catherine, in my second year of college. She was studying to be a nurse, and she had this way of looking at people like she could see the thing they were trying to hide. She asked me about my family early on, and I told her about my mother with warmth and about my father with something I probably thought was indifference, but that she recognized immediately as pain. She said to me once, "You talk about your father like he's someone you read about in a book." And she was right. I had turned him into a character in a story I told myself, the distant father, the man who couldn't love, and I had stopped seeing him as a person who might have his own reasons for being the way he was. Catherine and I married when I was 24. My father came to the wedding. He wore a suit I'd never seen before, and I found out later that my mother had taken him to buy it because he didn't own one. During the reception, he sat at a table near the back, and he watched everything with this expression I couldn't read. Not happy, not sad, just watchful, like he was trying to memorize it. He didn't make a toast. He didn't dance. When it was time to leave, he put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed it once, firmly, and said, "You did good." And then he walked to the truck and drove home. Catherine and I had 2 children, a daughter named Ellen and a son named Thomas. And here's where the story turns. Because when Thomas was born, something shifted in me that I wasn't prepared for. I held that boy in the hospital, and I looked at his face, and I felt a love so enormous and so terrifying that I couldn't speak. I literally could not form words. Catherine asked me if I was all right, and I just nodded because my throat had closed and my eyes were burning, and I was overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what I felt. For this tiny person I'd known for less than an hour. And in that moment, for just a flash, I thought of my father. I thought, is this what he felt? And then I pushed the thought away, because it didn't fit the story I'd been telling myself. As my children grew, I made a conscious effort to be the father mine wasn't. I told Ellen and Thomas I loved them every single day. I went to every game, every recital, every school play. I asked them about their feelings. I held them when they cried. And I was proud of that. I was proud that I had broken whatever chain my father had wrapped around his own heart. But there was something underneath that pride that I didn't examine for a long time, and it was this. Every act of affection I gave my children was also, in some small way, an accusation against my father. Every time I said I love you to Thomas, part of me was saying, see, it's not that hard. You could have done this. You chose not to. My father got sick when he was 71. Lung cancer, which wasn't a surprise, given that he'd smoked since he was 15. My mother called me and told me in that steady voice she used when things were serious. And I drove home that weekend. When I walked into the house, he was sitting in his chair, thinner than I'd ever seen him, and he looked up at me and said, "You didn't have to come all this way." That was his way. Even dying, he didn't want to be a burden. Even dying, he couldn't ask for what he needed. I visited every 2 weeks during his illness. We'd sit together in the living room and watch baseball on television, and sometimes he'd comment on a pitch or a play, and those were the closest things to real conversations we ever had. One afternoon, about 3 months before he died, I was sitting across from him, and I felt this surge of something, anger or grief or both, and I almost said it. I almost said, "Dad, did you love me?" I had the words right there on my tongue. But I looked at his face, at how thin he'd gotten, at the way his hands shook when he lifted his coffee cup, and I swallowed it. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I told myself I'd made my peace with it, but that was a lie, and I think we both knew it. He died on a Tuesday in March. My mother called at 6 in the morning and said, "Your father's gone, Arthur." And I sat on the edge of my bed, and I felt nothing. That's not true. I felt something, but it was so far down and so tangled up with decades of protected distance that I couldn't reach it. I drove to the house, and I helped my brothers make the arrangements, and I stood at the funeral, and I delivered a eulogy that was respectful and appropriate and completely hollow. I talked about his work ethic and his reliability and his quiet strength, which are the things you say about a man when you don't know what else to say. After the funeral, my mother asked me to help clean out his workshop in the garage. My father had spent most of his evenings out there, tinkering with things, fixing things, building things nobody asked him to build. I'd always assumed it was just another way he avoided us. The workshop was cluttered and smelled like sawdust and motor oil, and as I was going through the drawers of his workbench, I found a metal box tucked behind a row of coffee cans full of screws and bolts. It was an old tobacco tin, rusted at the edges, and inside it were papers. Folded, yellowed, some of them brittle. There were newspaper clippings. Every single one of them was about me, my high school baseball stats from the local paper, a small article about my college scholarship, a clipping from the announcement of my wedding, a photocopy of a newsletter from the company where I'd gotten my first engineering job, with my name circled in pencil. There was a photograph of me on the mound during a game my junior year of high school that I didn't even know anyone had taken. And underneath all of that, there was a letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't in an envelope. It was written on lined paper in my father's handwriting, which I recognized because it looked exactly like mine, this cramped, slanted script. That leans a little too far to the right. It was dated June of 1974, which would have been the summer after I graduated from college. And it read in its entirety, "I don't know how to say the things I should say to you. I have tried, and it doesn't come out right, and I am afraid it will sound foolish or that. You will think less of me for saying it badly. Your mother is better at this than I am. She always has been. But I want you to know that there has not been a single day since you were born that I have not thought about you and hoped that your life would be better than mine. I am proud of you in a way I cannot explain. I think you turned out good, and I think that is mostly because of your mother, but I hope some of it is because of me too. I wish I could tell you this to your face. I have practiced it in my head 100 times, but when I see you, the words go somewhere. I can't reach them. I love you. I have always loved you. I'm sorry, I don't know how to show it. I stood in that garage, and I read that letter, and I broke. I don't mean I cried, although I did. I mean something inside me that had been locked in place for 40 years came apart all at once, and I sat down on the concrete floor, and I held that piece of paper, and I grieved, not for my father's death, but for all the years I had spent being wrong about him. For all the years I had interpreted his silence as absence when it was actually the opposite. He was so full of what he felt that he couldn't get it out. The love was there the whole time. It was enormous. It was just trapped inside a man who never learned the language for it. I thought about his father dying on that factory floor when he was 11. I thought about what that does to a boy, losing the person who was supposed to teach him how to be a man. And then growing up in a world that told him men don't cry, men don't say soft things. Men provide and protect and keep their mouths shut about the rest. My father wasn't cold. My father was a man who had been taught by grief and by the world he grew up in. That love was something you proved with your hands and your presence, not with your words. He showed up every single day. He drove me to school in the rain. He bought a suit he couldn't afford for my wedding. He sat in that garage and cut out newspaper clippings about a son he didn't know how to talk to, and kept them in a tin like they were sacred things. That was his love language, if you want to call it that. Although he would have never used a phrase like that. He would have just called it doing what you're supposed to do. I took that letter home, and I showed it to Catherine, and she read it, and she looked at me, and she said, "Arthur, he sounds exactly like you." And I didn't understand what she meant at first, but then I did, and it hit me like a second wave. Because she was right. For all my efforts to be different from my father, for all the I love yous I said to my children, there were things I held back too. There were fears I never voiced. There were moments when Thomas or Ellen needed me to be vulnerable, truly vulnerable, and I gave them warmth instead, which is close, but not the same thing. I had inherited more of my father's walls than I wanted to admit. I had just painted them a different color. I started talking to Thomas about this a few years ago, when he was in his late 30s and going through his own struggles with his teenage son. He told me that he sometimes felt like he didn't know how to reach the boy, that he'd say the right things, but they'd come out sounding rehearsed. And I recognized that feeling so deeply, it made my chest ache. I told him about the letter. I told him about his grandfather. And I said something to him that I wish someone had said to me 50 years earlier. I said, "Thomas, the fact that you're worried about it means you're already doing better than you think. The men who fail at this are the ones who don't notice the gap. You notice it. That's not the problem. That's the beginning of the answer. I think about my father every day now. Not with the old resentment, not with the guarded distance I carried for so long, but with something that I can only describe as tenderness. I understand him now in a way I couldn't when he was alive." You can't call them. You can't sit across from them and say, "I read your letter, Dad. I know now. I'm sorry I didn't know sooner." You just carry it with you, and you let it change the way you move through whatever time you have left. I'm 83 years old, and I have lived long enough to learn that the people who love us the most are not always the ones who say it the loudest. Sometimes love is a man who works a job he hates for 30 years, so his sons can go to college. Sometimes love is a hand on your shoulder that squeezes once and lets go. Sometimes love is a letter that never gets sent, folded up and hidden in a tin box in a garage, waiting for someone to find it and finally hear what was always being said. My father loved me. He loved me so much that it overwhelmed him, and because no one ever taught him what to do with that feeling, he just held it inside and hoped that somehow I would know. And I didn't know, not for a very long time. But I know now. If you're watching this and you have someone in your life who is quiet in the way my father was quiet, someone whose love doesn't look the way you think love is supposed to look, I want to ask you to consider the possibility that their silence isn't empty. It might be the fullest thing about them. It might be so full that they don't know where to begin. And if you can, don't wait until they're gone to find out. Don't wait for the letter in the drawer. Go to them now, while there's still time, and sit with them, and let them love you in whatever broken, imperfect, quiet way they know how. Because that's the thing about love that took me 83 years to understand. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just shows up every single day and does what needs to be done and hopes that one day. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope some of these reflections resonate with you. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel for more stories and lessons from a life lived. Take care.